You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
The morning of June 6, 1944, began as a critical moment in World War II. The Allied forces, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, launched the largest amphibious military invasion in history, Operation Overlord. This operation would involve over 7,000 ships and over 156,000 soldiers landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. It was a decisive battle that would ultimately change the fate of Europe and mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the soldiers who were about to land, such as 19-year-old John Roman, it was a moment fraught with uncertainty. He, along with many others, had little knowledge of their destination until they reached the shores of Normandy. As they set sail across the choppy English Channel, the soldiers were gripped by fear and anxiety. The boats in which they travelled were overcrowded, and many of the men struggled with seasickness. The hours leading up to the invasion were tense, with many not knowing if they would survive the day. There were no guarantees. This was a gamble that could either liberate Europe or end in catastrophe. The German military, however, had prepared heavily for this moment. The Nazis had constructed the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, minefields, and artillery defences that stretched across nearly 2,000 kilometres of French coastline. Thousands of German soldiers were stationed along these shores, waiting for the inevitable assault. With such fortified defences, it seemed almost impossible for the Allies to succeed. The odds were stacked against them, but the outcome of the war depended on this invasion. In the weeks and months leading up to D-Day, the Allies had been working on a series of plans, but there was one thing they had to get right: where and when to land. They could not risk an invasion where the German forces were most concentrated. The Germans had been expecting an attack along the French coast for some time, but they didn't know exactly when or where. This ambiguity was the key to the success of Operation Overlord. It was not just about launching the attack, it was about deceiving the enemy into misdirecting their forces away from the real invasion site. This deception was of the highest importance, and behind the scenes, Operation Fortitude was being carefully executed. This operation was meant to mislead the German military, convincing them that the Allies would land at a location far away from Normandy, on the narrow stretch of coast at the Pas de Calais. The Allies needed the Germans to focus their defences elsewhere, leaving the beaches of Normandy less protected. This would give the Allied forces the element of surprise they desperately needed to succeed. Operation Fortitude, which began in earnest in late 1943, was a daring and elaborate deception designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would occur at Pas de Calais, rather than Normandy. The mastermind behind this deception was John Bevon, a trusted officer in Winston Churchill's inner circle. Bevon's job was to make Hitler and the German High Command believe that a massive army poised to invade the Pas de Calais was already stationed in southeastern England. To achieve this, Bevon and his team devised an audacious plan. They would create a fake army out of thin air. This ghost army would consist of fake tanks, trucks, landing craft, and even planes, all designed to look completely real from the air. The objective was clear: mislead the Germans into thinking the Allies would launch their invasion in the north, so they would move their troops and artillery away from Normandy. This massive ruse would be built on creating a false impression of military might that would appear legitimate from enemy reconnaissance. To pull off this deception, Bevon's team turned to a novel material that was just starting to be used in new technologies: synthetic rubber. This material was lightweight, yet durable, making it perfect for the creation of large, inflatable decoys. Inspired by the giant balloons used in Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York, Bevon's team realized that they could use inflatable rubber to create incredibly lifelike models of tanks, trucks, and even airplanes. This was a stroke of genius. The rubber decoys were light enough to be transported and easy to set up, and they would look convincing when seen from the air. By February of 1944, the first shipments of these inflatable tanks, trucks, and planes arrived in Kent, southeastern England. The team quickly set to work, inflating these decoys and placing them in strategic locations where they could be easily spotted by German reconnaissance planes. The terrain in Kent was ideal for this operation. It was flat and open, making it easy for the Germans to spot the decoys from the sky. The plan was to create an entire fake army positioned just across from the French coast, to fool the Germans into thinking that the main Allied assault would come at the Pas de Calais, where the coast was much narrower. The team placed these fake tanks and trucks along roads, in fields, and in areas visible from the sky. They even used camouflage nets to make sure the decoys blended into the surroundings. The inflatable tanks looked remarkably lifelike, complete with turrets, tracks, and guns. The decoys were so realistic that they could easily be mistaken for real military vehicles, especially from a distance. But the Allies weren't just making a show of these inflatable tanks. They were carefully placing them in such a way that the Germans would see them as part of a massive invasion force ready to launch a major assault. But it wasn't just about the decoys. Bavon's team had to create a false narrative, one that would fool the Germans into believing that this fake army was real. They used every trick in the book, even incorporating a network of fake radio transmissions, fake air reconnaissance reports, and false intelligence reports to make the Germans believe they were facing a full-scale invasion at Pas de Calais. The stakes were high. If the Germans discovered the deception, the entire operation would collapse. The deception didn't stop with inflatable decoys and fake transmissions. To make the fake army seem even more credible, Bavon and his team needed a high-profile figure to lead this ghost army. And who better than General George S. Patton, one of the most well-known and feared American military commanders. Patton was a charismatic, larger-than-life figure who had earned a reputation for his leadership during the North African and Sicilian campaigns. His name was known throughout the German military, and his presence would lend authenticity to the ruse. Bavon's team arranged for Patton to visit the area where the fake army was stationed, ensuring that his presence was photographed and widely reported. They staged several inspection tours in Kent, carefully positioning Patton so that the Germans could easily spot him. Patton, ever the showman, played along with the plan, giving speeches and posing for photographs with the decoys. His presence was meant to be the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that would convince the Germans that the Allies were preparing to launch an invasion in the north. Patton's reputation preceded him, and the Germans feared him. He was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to lead soldiers in the heat of battle. By photographing him inspecting the fake army and disseminating these photos through the press, Bavon's team ensured that the Germans would believe that Patton was leading a real invasion force in the north. The Germans, who already suspected the Allies might land in this area, would now have undeniable proof that the invasion was imminent. The deception worked. The Germans, already on edge and preparing for an assault, saw Patton's presence as confirmation that the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais. They moved thousands of soldiers, along with artillery and tanks, to the region in preparation for the expected landing. Meanwhile, the real landing was still months away. The Germans were now completely fixated on the wrong location, and their focus on Pas de Calais would prove to be a critical mistake. As the deception continued to unfold, the Allies knew that the real invasion would take place at Normandy. The planning for D-Day was in full swing, and the soldiers were assembling in the southwest of England, ready to carry out the mission that would eventually change the course of the war. But the soldiers themselves were kept in the dark about their destination. For men like John Roman, the uncertainty was a constant source of stress. They knew something big was coming, but they had no idea where they would land or what awaited them. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Allies relied heavily on intelligence to ensure that their strategy would work. One of the most important assets in this effort was the work of the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Since 1941, the team at Bletchley had been intercepting and decoding German communications using the groundbreaking Enigma machine. This allowed the Allies to read German radio messages, track troop movements, and gather critical information about German plans. The success of Bletchley Park's codebreakers was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Thanks to their work, the Allies were able to anticipate German responses to Allied movements and to stay one step ahead of their enemy. This intelligence would be crucial to the success of D-Day, as the Allies could use it to guide their decisions on where to strike and how to deploy their forces. At the same time, the Allies were also relying on the work of double agents like Juan Pujol, known by his codename Garbo. Pujol was a Spanish man who had originally tried to offer his services as a spy to the British but had been turned away. Undeterred, he approached the Germans and offered to work for them as a spy. The Germans, eager for intelligence, believed his story and sent him to Britain as an undercover agent. But Pujol wasn't working for the Germans. Instead, he was feeding them false information. His real allegiance lay with the Allies. Under the guise of a German spy, Pujol crafted elaborate lies about the movements and intentions of the British and American forces. He played his role so convincingly that the Germans came to trust him completely. They believed every piece of information he sent them, which allowed the Allies to feed them a steady stream of false intelligence that convinced them the invasion would occur in the north. Pujol's role in Operation Fortitude was crucial. Through his fake reports, he provided the Germans with the intelligence they needed to build their defensive strategy. He even claimed that he had recruited additional spies, providing them with detailed information that supported the illusion of a massive force gathering in southeastern England. By the time the real invasion began, the Germans were convinced that a large Allied army was preparing to land at the Pas de Calais. Pujol's work, along with the inflatable decoys and Patton's staged visits, ensured that the Germans focused their defences in the wrong place. By the time June 6, 1944 arrived, the Allies were ready to strike. At 2 a.m. on that fateful morning, the first wave of soldiers began their assault on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion had been meticulously planned for months, and every detail was in place. But no plan, no matter how well thought out, can ever fully account for the chaos and confusion of battle. As the soldiers landed on the beaches, they were met with fierce German resistance. For John Roman and his fellow soldiers, this was the moment they had been training for. The boats carrying them through the dark waters of the English Channel rocked violently as they neared the shore. The soldiers were exhausted from the journey and still unsure of what awaited them. As they landed, they were immediately met with a wall of German gunfire. The Germans had fortified the beaches with machine guns, artillery, and mines, creating a killing zone for the incoming soldiers. The first few hours of the invasion were brutal. Soldiers waded through the surf, weighed down by their heavy backpacks, while under constant fire from the German positions. For many, it was their first taste of battle, and for many others, it would be their last. The Germans were dug in, well-positioned, and ready for the attack. It was a slaughter. At Utah Beach, where John Roman landed, over 200 men were killed within the first few hours. The chaos and confusion of battle were overwhelming, and many soldiers simply didn't know where to turn. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Allies pressed on. They fought through the German defences, inching closer to their objectives. The landings were not going according to plan, and the situation seemed grim, but the Allies refused to back down. With each passing hour, the soldiers began to push forward. The tide was turning, and slowly but surely, the Germans began to retreat. As the battle for Normandy unfolded, the Allies' primary goal was to capture key locations, particularly Cherbourg, the largest port in the region. Cherbourg was vital to the success of the invasion, as it would allow the Allies to resupply their troops and move men and equipment across the English Channel. Without this port, the Allies would be forced to rely on overextended supply lines that were vulnerable to German attacks. The success of the operation hinged on securing Cherbourg quickly. For the French civilians, the arrival of the American forces was a moment of relief and joy. Many of them had lived under the brutal Nazi occupation for years, and the sight of the Allied forces was a welcome change. The French people celebrated their liberation with enthusiasm, and the GIs were greeted like heroes. For soldiers like John Roman, this was a moment of victory after the intense fighting on the beaches. They had succeeded, but the cost had been high. However, even as the Allies made progress, there were tensions between the soldiers and the local population. The presence of thousands of young American soldiers far from home led to complications. While many French women formed romantic relationships with the soldiers, the situation wasn't always peaceful. The American army, which had brought large numbers of men to France, struggled to maintain order. In many areas, particularly in the liberated towns and villages, there were reports of sexual violence, theft, and general misconduct. These acts were largely swept under the rug at the time, as the Allies were focused on the victory of the invasion. But decades later, criminologist Robert Lilly would uncover the dark reality of these acts in his study of the period. Lilly's groundbreaking research in 2003 revealed that the rape of French women by American soldiers was far more widespread than anyone had previously acknowledged. According to his findings, 181 rapes were officially recorded between June 1944 and June 1945, though this number was likely much higher. Many women never came forward to report these crimes, and many of those that were reported were dismissed or ignored. The topic was a taboo for many years, overshadowed by the heroism of the D-Day landings and the focus on the military's victories. One particularly tragic case involved a young French woman named Marie, who was raped by 2 American soldiers in the summer of 1944. The incident occurred just a few months after D-Day, when tensions were high and the fighting was still intense. Marie's assault was one of many cases that went largely unreported at the time, though it would eventually become known when the American military police investigated the crime. The soldiers responsible for the assault were quickly identified, and one of them confessed to the crime. Both soldiers were brought to trial and sentenced to death, as ordered by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This case was one of the rare instances where justice was served. The 2 soldiers were executed publicly in the presence of Marie in order to send a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated. However, this was the exception, not the rule. Many other crimes went unpunished, leaving a dark stain on the legacy of the liberation. These actions, though not representative of all American soldiers, were a stark reminder of the complexities of war and the consequences of unbridled power. The number of sexual assaults and other violent acts committed by American soldiers in France is difficult to quantify. While Lilly's research provides the best available data, many of these crimes were never reported, either due to fear or shame. The secrecy surrounding these incidents only increased with time, as many of the victims were reluctant to speak out. In addition to the 181 rapes officially recorded, it is likely that many more women suffered similar fates without ever receiving justice. These crimes, while not the focus of most historical accounts of D-Day, offer a sobering reality of what occurred in the aftermath of the invasion. The soldiers who liberated France were hailed as heroes, but they were not immune to the same human flaws that exist in every war. The tension between liberation and the brutality of war was evident not only on the front lines but also in the interactions between soldiers and civilians. The French people, who had suffered under Nazi rule, were now forced to navigate the complex realities of post-liberation life, including the actions of their liberators. For many women in France, the arrival of the American soldiers marked a new chapter in their lives, one that brought both freedom and trauma. The violence and sexual assault that occurred during this time left scars that would last for generations. While some found romance and relief in the arms of their American liberators, others were left to cope with the horrors of abuse and violence that occurred in the chaos of war. Despite the horrors of war and the darkness that lingered behind the celebrations of liberation, the Allies were victorious. Within weeks of the D-Day invasion, the Allies had secured critical positions along the coast of Normandy, and by late June, Cherbourg had been captured. The liberation of France was a monumental achievement. It allowed the Allies to establish a foothold in Western Europe and begin pushing the Germans back. But the road ahead was still long. The Germans continued to fight fiercely, and the battle for France would stretch on for months. The Allies would need to maintain their momentum and push deeper into the heart of France. The next objective was Paris, a city that had been under Nazi occupation for over 4 years. As the Americans and their allies advanced through France, they liberated city after city, each victory bringing them closer to Paris. But while the fighting continued, the human cost of the invasion was evident. The stories of heroism and sacrifice that emerged from the invasion were tempered by the dark truths of what occurred in the wake of the liberation. Soldiers like John Roman would carry the weight of these memories for the rest of their lives, knowing that their victory was hard-won and came at a great cost. The liberation of France remains one of the most significant turning points in World War II. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but it also revealed the harsh realities of war. The bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy will forever be remembered, but so too should the darker aspects of the liberation. The crimes committed by a small number of American soldiers, though overshadowed by the overall victory, are a part of this complex history. The aftermath of D-Day, with its victories and tragedies, is a reminder that war is never black and white. It's a story of triumph and loss, of courage and cruelty, of liberation and suffering. The liberation of France was a monumental achievement, but it also brought to light the complexities of human nature in the chaos of war. As we remember D-Day, it is essential to acknowledge both the heroism and the horror, for only then can we truly understand the full scope of its impact.